Hi everyone. Welcome to day one of mini lectures in contracts. I'm going to do a little short mini lecture that I'll post online and send out a link for you all to be able to view. Because I'll be doing this mini lecture first, what I'm going to do for class today is start our group call at noon, and I'll send an email out to that effect. And on our group call, we'll go through some of the problems and discussion of our case for today. But I'm going to try to keep the group calls short so that we're not all online for an hour and a half trying to do a group conference call. So we're getting into a new chapter on conditions and promises, and I think that this is material that you can make it more complex than it really is. So I'm going to try to break it down, talk about different ways of looking at and thinking about the material, and give this material a chance to sit in your heads, think about it. We'll have a discussion board open where you can talk about it that way. And during the actual class sessions, please pipe up, ask questions of me, either vocally or there'll be a chat option during the online sessions where you can type in questions as well. All right, so let's begin. I think a helpful place to start is just trying to kind of wrap our heads around how promises can be different from conditions. And so Professor Murray, who worked on the Corbin treatise and wrote his own contracts treatise, has this helpful schema for organizing promises and conditions. At least I find it helpful. Your mileage may vary. And so he organized this sort of distinctions between promises and conditions into a few different categories. So we'll talk through them. So the first difference is how promises and conditions are created. And so a promise is something that one party makes to the other. Typically, in a bilateral agreement, you have two promisors. One person promises to pay money. The other person promises to perform an action for that payment. So you have promise to promise, and we talked a lot last semester about how the exchange of those things are something that's important for consideration doctrine. All right, conditions are typically things that parties agree upon, and or you could have a court impose a condition. These we will talk about in the context of things like implied conditions, but these are things that are not necessarily something that parties are going to do in terms of performance. It could be something completely outside of their ability to perform happening or not happening. But the parties agree on what the condition is and how it's going to impact their contract. In terms of legal duties, when you make a promise to another person that becomes a legally enforceable, in a contractual sense, promise, you're creating a duty. By your private agreement, you're creating a duty that you're each going to do something. You're going to pay, you're going to perform a particular action. Conditions, on the other hand, usually act to postpone or in some way sequence a duty. So you don't have a duty to act unless or until some condition is met. If the condition is met, or when either a promise or a condition is met. Different things happen. So if you perform on your promise, your duty is done. Your duty is discharged. And related to that, if you perform your promise under the contract and the other party doesn't perform their promise under the contract, they're in breach. It's a breach of duty. For a condition being met triggers some sort of duty to act on the part of the parties to the contract. Or, and as your book talks about, you can have conditions if something happens, or conditions if something does not happen. So you can have positive or negative conditions. If a condition fails, typically what happens is the party's duty to perform further under the contract, or at least the party's duty to perform a particular promise under the contract, is discharged. And it's discharged in a way that they're not in breach. The condition failed to be met, and so they don't have to act. Duty is discharged, no damages, no breach. So there are different ways now that we're starting to really look at the language of contracts themselves carefully. And in this chapter, you're going to be asked to think about terms in contracts in the form of promises, conditions, or, and this is every student's favorite, a term that is arguably both a promise and a condition. So it has a promissory element, but its performance conditions other performance under the contract. Now, terms can either be express, right, wherein they're stated either orally or in writing clearly in the contract, and express terms tend to be enforced more strictly by courts, or they can be implied or construed. And we've talked about these language, implied, construed, or implication, construction, back when we were talking about courts' interpretation of agreements. But this is situations where the court says, your contract doesn't expressly say X, but the nature of the obligations that you already have in there imply that something should be the case. And we'll give some examples of implied conditions as we go through our talk today. We also want to think about timing for when things need to happen. So when must certain terms be performed? So is something precedent to something else? So this has to happen first, only then will the next thing happen? Or is it packaged in a way where they have to be concurrent or contemporaneous, so things are happening at the same time? Our restatement, R2K 224, describes a condition as an event not certain to occur, which must occur before performance under a contract becomes due. And as I said earlier, a condition can be positive, something must happen, or negative, something must not happen. We can't find out that the zoning is prohibited for the purpose we were building for. Throughout this chapter, we're going to see that promises we talked about these at great length last fall. What's a promise? So commitments to act or to forbear from acting often become conditions, and they're strung together in sequences to map out the parties' obligations and their expectations under the contract. So our goal today is to start to get a feel for when something is a promise, when it's a condition, and when it is this thing that is a little bit of both, the promissory condition. And one other thing that I think we should think about is, what is the purpose of a contract term? As your book suggests, is the term meant as an escape clause? So if something doesn't happen, then we get out of the contract, or we get out of some performance under the contract? Or is it meant as a way of channeling or sequencing parties' performance under a contract? And one of the reasons that these notions of escape clauses or sequencing, and whether something creates a duty or discharges a duty is important, is as we segue into our discussion about breach and damages, right? One of a party's arguments is likely to be, well, I wasn't in breach because my performance was excused because a condition didn't happen, or they had a duty to perform on a promise precedent to my having to perform. So they didn't do what they were supposed to do, which discharged my having to do something. So they're in breach, not me. So let's say I want to buy an Irish Wolfhound puppy, and I'm currently concerned about a couple of things. First of all, I have no money. I'm broke. Second of all, I don't know if my landlord is going to allow me to have a dog as big as an Irish Wolfhound. But I have this lead on some Irish Wolfhound puppies, and I want to lock the seller in because Irish Wolfhound puppies are incredibly popular, especially around St. Patrick's Day. So I write up this quick agreement on a piece of paper. Archard will pay $1,000 by check for Wild, the Irish Wolfhound. She will deliver the check and receive Wild on March 15th, 2020 at seller's residence, provided that 1, Archard is able to secure a loan for $1,000, and 2, Archard's landlord does not object to her keeping a wolfhound. So that's our agreement. So what are some of the promises that we see here? Well, I will pay by check. I will deliver the check and receive the dog. Right? These are all things that I promise I am going to do under this agreement. What are some of the conditions here? Getting a loan. That's a positive condition. I need to get the loan. And my landlord does not object. Right? That's a negative condition. Something that needs to not happen. Again, for a promise, a failure to perform a promise is a breach. If something's a pure condition, neither party is promising that it's going to be fulfilled. Right? So the non-fulfillment of that condition excuses performance. A promissory condition, and this is where I think sometimes it starts to feel tricky, is both a promise and a condition. So if it's a promissory condition and you fail to perform, then it is a breach. So if I say Archard will provide seller with written notice of landlord's approval of an Irish Wolfhound in the apartment, in her apartment, prior to seller delivering the dog to Archard, then if I don't provide that notice to the seller, I'm in breach and liable for the cost of the dog. So the promise I'm making there is my providing the notice to the seller. It's not really discretionary, right? I say I will provide the notice, but providing the notice is a condition of the seller delivering me the dog. So if I don't provide the notice from my landlord approving the dog in my apartment to the seller, then the seller's obligation to deliver the dog is discharged. Let's look into that idea of giving notice a little more in the context of express or implied statements. I write in, before receiving Wild, Archard will provide seller with a written notice from her landlord stating that an Irish Wolfhound is allowed in Archard's apartment. And the landlord writes, Archard may have big dogs in her apartment. That's the written notice that I get from my landlord. Well, Irish Wolfhounds are really big dogs. They are the tallest of all dog breeds. A competitive Irish Wolfhound has to be a minimum of 120 pounds. So does this language, Archard may have big dogs in her apartment, cut it? I have an express statement here that I'm going to give a written notice from my landlord stating that, and this is quoting from the language, an Irish Wolfhound is allowed. So if the landlord just writes, Archard may have big dogs in her apartment, the seller has a colorable argument that I haven't fulfilled the express terms of our agreement. Now let's go back to some earlier language, this provided that Archard is able to secure a loan for $1,000. It doesn't say that Archard must secure a loan or that Archard uses her best efforts to secure a loan, but there is a condition here, right, that I secure a loan for $1,000, and there's some implied promises that flow from that, such as my using reasonable efforts to secure a loan. So it doesn't really need to say that expressly. A court is likely to imply that I am going to use my best efforts. The court may also choose to construe that the loan has to be on fair or commercially reasonable terms. So none of that is expressly written in this provision that provided this condition, provided that Archard is able to secure a loan for $1,000. But those kinds of performance obligations, those kinds of promises will be implied. I want to say a little bit about conditions precedent and subsequent. As your book points out, don't get too caught up in these distinctions. Right? So a condition precedent is an obligation. It suspends performance until the condition is met. Right? So a duty to perform doesn't arise until the condition occurs. A condition subsequent discharges performance. Typically, the performance is discharged by non-occurrence of a condition. And so the condition terminates a duty that began when the contract was formed. So when the contract was formed, you had this duty to do something, but if some condition subsequent, typically the non-occurrence of a condition happens, or rather fails to happen, then you get out. Right? Your further performance, your further duty to perform is waived. So the effect of these two statements, the one on the left being a condition precedent and the one on the right being a condition subsequent, is the same. Right, so buyer's obligation to purchase the Irish Wolfhound is conditioned upon receipt of landlord's waiver for large dogs within 10 days of the date of this agreement. And so agreement is signed. I don't actually have to purchase, right, unless I receive this waiver. Versus buyer's obligation to purchase the Irish Wolfhound will be discharged if the landlord's waiver for large dogs is not received within 10 days of the date of this agreement. Right? So there, the purchase obligation exists as of the time of formation, but it's discharged, right? So it goes away if this waiver doesn't happen. So the effect is the same of both of these. No approval, I don't have to buy the dog. The distinction lies in the burden of proof. So if we're looking at this condition precedent, the seller, and so we're looking at this condition precedent, I'm now trying to get out of this agreement as the buyer. The seller is going to have to prove that I didn't get this waiver. On the other hand, if we're looking at this condition subsequent, right, I now am using this as the excuse for my non-performance, right? So I, the buyer, am going to have to prove that this thing did not happen as part of my defense for why I shouldn't have to perform. So again, let's say I did decide I want to back out of the contract, and I have the $1,000, I have the landlord's approval, but I decide I'm just going to be an unethical liar. And I say, oh, my landlord never got back to me. The seller suspects I'm lying and that I'm simply trying to get out of the contract. If the contract is worded like the phrase on the left, right, conditioned upon receipt of landlord's waiver, then the seller has the burden of proving that I did get that waiver, and I'm just sitting on it. If it's written like the phrase on the right, will be discharged if landlord's waiver is not received, then that's part of my defense, and I have to prove I did not receive the waiver. Right? So if I'm not lying and I'm not unethical, that might mean I have to do something like get my landlord on this stand or depose my landlord and have the landlord say, yeah, I never gave the waiver. In either of these, there's an implied condition, right? Or an implied promissory condition for either of these, and that's that I actually seek out the landlord's permission in a timely manner within that 10-day window. So even though it doesn't say that I need to seek the landlord's permission, that's clearly implied by these terms. So let's walk through what happens when you have something that has both elements of promise and a condition. And so I have my contract to buy Wild the dog, subject to my obtaining this $1,000 loan. As we discussed, a court's likely to say that there's an implied promise of reasonable good faith efforts to secure a loan. In the contract, there's an express condition that if Archer can't secure the loan, she doesn't have to buy the dog. Let's say that my implied promise of a good faith effort is met. So I did, in fact, attempt to secure a loan. If it's satisfied, the loan's approved, then I now have an obligation to buy wild. If it's not satisfied, the condition isn't satisfied, the loan's not approved, then my performance is excused. I may choose not to buy the dog. Now let's say that my implied promise of good faith effort is broken. And so I don't attempt to secure the loan. So now we have a condition that's not satisfied, but arguably a breach of implied promise. Right? And the breach of that implied promise, the fact that I didn't use efforts, good faith efforts to actually get a loan, ends up excusing the condition, which means that the seller could still argue, hey, this sale should be enforceable, right? And if I fail to buy the dog, then I'm breaching the contract. Let's take a look at 18.1, and then I'm going to stop us there so we can talk about the other problems during our live session. Right, so there is this lease agreement that we were introduced to in Chapter 18 between Amber and Bud, and we have this provision that Amber must give written notice of intent to renew to Bud no later than March 31st of the final year of the initial lease period. So let's say, first scenario, she hand delivers a writing at 8 a.m. on April 1st. Well, so the question is, has Amber violated an express condition, right, such that a court is likely to strictly enforce it? Right, so if the condition is expressed, we do have this doctrine of strict compliance with express conditions, and that would make the late delivery of the notice ineffective. If it's not express, then the late notice may be effective as it could, satisfy an implied or construed condition, or a court might say that her performance substantially complies with the terms of the contract. Courts generally don't favor waiving an entire agreement, particularly something like the renewal of a lease agreement where the tenant already has a lot invested in the property. It's sometimes called forfeiture because of some technical violation of a renewal term. So the question becomes here, is this provision clear enough where the court is going to say, yeah, this is clearly articulated and we're going to enforce it, or not? It says she must give written notice to Bud no later than March 31st of the final year of the initial lease period, and she is late. She's delivering it April 1st rather than March 31st. So I think this is one where courts might be a bit split. Some courts are going to say, technically you were too late. Other courts might be a little more lenient since she did get very close. What about B? So she sends an email at 6 p.m. on March 31st. Well, the language of the contract itself here only says that she has to give written notice. It doesn't say anything more technical than that about the nature of the writing. And so here it would seem as though, even though it's sent after business hours, even though it's not some sort of printed writing, there's nothing that seems to expressly violate the written terms of this agreement. Now, what about this final scenario where there's a call at noon and she calls him and tells him that she intended to exercise her right of renewal. Later that day, she mailed a written notice of renewal, which he received on April 2nd. Right. Here there's some ambiguity as to whether this has to be received on March 31st or not. And then the other thing that I hope that you're thinking about as I'm talking is essentially this is accepting an outstanding offer to renew the lease. So if she mails written notice of renewal, she has a pretty good argument that what she's doing is accepting an outstanding offer. And so what do we have? Mailbox rule. Without anything expressly written in the terms of the agreement itself, her acceptance should be effective upon dispatch in the mail. So I think that combination of, they did have a call in which Bud was given notice and she did dispatch her written notice on March 31st, probably would allow the renewal to be enforceable in this scenario. Okay, that is it for this mini lecture. We will pick up in class with a discussion of problems 18.3 and 18.4 and one of everybody's favorite classic cases with Jacobs and Young v. Kent and Cardozo's opinion about a bunch of pipes. Take care, and I will talk to you soon.